Warning: some viewers may find this content disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Reddit: what's your most disturbing, scary or creepy true story? My parents sent me to live with my grandmother when I was 7. They had to work in another city for a couple of months while waiting for my big brother to finish middle school. I was ecstatic to live at my grandma's, since she would spoil the hell out of me. She lived in a 2-bedroom house with 4 of my aunts and my uncle. However, 3 of my aunts and me slept piled into one bedroom while my uncle and grandma slept in the living room. The reason? One of my aunts was schizophrenic and had a whole bedroom to herself. My aunt had been crazy for years. My grandma wasn't the best making her take her pills, and she would spend hours talking to herself and drawing with crayons on the wall. Looking back, it's creepy as hell. But as a child I was having a blast living in a house where I was the most sane person around. This ended rather abruptly when I woke up with my crazy aunt pointing some scissors at my neck. The most plausible story is that she wanted to cut one of my hair strands, as she had picked this habit of cutting hair for a couple of months. However, we never knew for sure. Almost immediately my parents picked me up, and moved to a very old house where earthworms came out of the toilet and shower drain at night. As a child I thought I had woken to a living nightmare. I was at my mother's funeral sitting down while somebody was giving a eulogy. All of a sudden it got cold and I turned to see a bunch of leaves flying around my mother's urn. Later that night my dad and I were driving back to the hotel we were staying at. On the way, I just felt nothing but chills going down my spine. We arrived at the hotel and when I got into the room, I went over to shut the window shades but something caught my eye and I looked down at the parking lot down below. It was a faint white figure that looked very much like my mom and it just smiled and vanished. During the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in California. He'd lead groups of tourists on horseback across mountain trails and such, and he met a lot of people during his time there. He met this Native American guy, who started out as a regular customer and eventually became an employee. He came from an Indian reservation, although he never said which. He also didn't explain why he left. But he was a cool guy, so my dad never really gave his origins much thought. He always figured that he left for personal reasons and didn't want to be bothered about it, so my dad never brought it up. One day, my dad, his brother, and his Native American friend were out on the trail with a group of people. It was a pretty ordinary day. My dad and uncle told jokes back and forth, their friend laughing and jeering, and the tourists took pictures with their bulky cameras. Nothing unusual. As they were moving along, somebody shouted, "Coyote," and pointed into a little valley on the left side of the field. Again, nothing strange. This was in the grassy chaparral of Central California, and coyotes are a very common sight. My dad and his companions stopped their horses so that their guests could have a look at the creature. My dad and his friend got to chatting, but my uncle kept staring at the coyote, with his features all scrunched up, like he was trying to get a better look. My dad asked him what was up, and he said, "This coyote. It doesn't look healthy." The coyote had very long and thin legs, and it didn't walk normally. Most dogs walk by lifting a front leg and then lifting the opposite back leg, but this coyote walked by lifting both legs on one side of its body, sort of like a camel. Its snout was also a good 3 inches longer than normal, and it held its nose high into the air, as if it was sniffing for something. My dad said that it was probably just deformed, and my uncle agreed. Their friend, however, was silent. He was slightly shivering, and staring directly at the weird coyote. My dad put his hand on his shoulder, and asked, "What's wrong?" With a shaking finger, his friend pointed at the coyote and said, "The tail. Look at the tail." My dad looked, and said, "What do you mean? It has no tail." The friend said that he'd explain everything when they got back to base camp, so my dad led the guests down the trail. The coyote followed them. It didn't come up from the valley, but it followed the group. The tourists thought it was fun to have a little companion, but my dad's friend never looked at it. He was silent the whole way back. When they were just a couple hundred yards from the base camp, the coyote leapt out of the underbrush, about 20 feet in front of my dad and his companions, freaking the fuck out of them and the horses. The coyote stared directly at my dad's friend, and smiled. Not a panting smile, like most dogs do, but a full-on, teeth-bared smile, which showed off its yellow, brown-stained teeth. The friend stared back, and produced a small piece of wood with an arrow burned into it. He showed its face to the coyote, which looked away. Then, the creature howled. Coyote howls are usually high-pitched, but this one was very low-pitched, almost baritone. It sounded like the thing had fluid in its lungs, as if it was drowning and able to make one final scream. Then it ran back into the bushes. My uncle, ever the jokester, turned to the stunned tourists and said, "Well, I hope you guys got your money's worth." At camp, my dad's friend wouldn't give them the whole story, only vague statements like, "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me." He said that he did this to protect my dad and uncle because the less you know about it, the better. He gave them each a small piece of wood with an arrow on it, saying that it would protect them from the thing. He'd made them himself, he said, and he was glad that he got to test them out. He drove out at 8 o'clock, and my dad never saw him again. My father always used to tell this story when I was younger, especially during camping trips. He's a high-spirited kind of guy, so he always tells it in good spirits. But sometimes, he says that on cold nights, when the wind is blowing and there's a rustling in the trees, he can hear the low howl of the thing that wasn't a coyote. Our old house was at the corner, pretty secluded and near a main road. One night I woke up to hear my mom yelling. I was sleeping on the futon and this guy wearing all black just strode over me running. The burglar ran off before he got anything. I was more surprised to be woken up that early rather than the fact a burglar just broke into the house. Wasn't the first time the house got broken into, certainly not the last. We weren't rich by any stretch, mind you, pretty much lower middle class. Other than that, I woken up to sleep paralysis, and at the time was pretty convinced whatever that was behind me, as I was lying on my side, it was evil. I could just move my eyeballs and all of my instincts told me not to look at it. All I felt was pure fear. I'd been living in my first apartment alone for maybe 2 weeks. It was a basement apartment, which meant cheap. And the windows were right at ground level so you could see legs and shoes walk by. There were 2 bedrooms. I slept in one with the blinds closed, but the other room's window had some water damage, so I kept the blinds all the way up to let it dry out before maintenance came. That room had nothing in it but spare boxes from moving in. One night, I was asleep and then suddenly completely awake and alert. Every fiber of my being suddenly on edge. I looked at my phone and saw it was around 4 a.m. I lay in bed for a minute before I turned towards my closed window and saw it, a large dark shadow of a person with a flashlight trying to see into my bedroom. I instantly freaked. I quietly grabbed a small hunting knife and stealthily moved to the hall so I could see into the other bedroom, the one whose window coverings were wide open. As I peeked around the corner, the person was scanning the floor of my bedroom methodically with a flashlight. They were big, had on heavy boots, and keys that jingled. At this point, as a single girl alone in a shitty apartment, I thought this was it. I was 100% prepared to take my little hunting knife and fight this fucker. My adrenaline was sky high. At that moment, my phone buzzed and I got a text from a friend on the police force who literally asked, "What's going on at your apartment?" I thought, yep, this is a bad guy. He's peering in my windows and is going to bust in any second now. But then he went away. I didn't hear from my police friend after I texted him back. I decided to go lie down on my bed and just wait to see what happened next. Not 5 minutes after lying down, someone knocked on my door with incredible force. The panic mounted again. Now I have no peephole, no safety chain, just a deadbolt. At the top of my voice, in case it's a murderer or I want to wake people up, I yell, "Who is it?" I hear a meek voice reply that it is the police. My first thought is, now that is a clever plan to get a girl to open her apartment door. I stood there silently before I heard the voice say again, that I wasn't in trouble. I opened the door a smidgen, ready to slam it, to see 2 cops, one backed away from the door and one up the steps. They must have seen my tiny little knife or something. They proceeded to apologize for scaring me. They were the ones looking in my windows. I yelled at them and possibly cried a little. The adrenaline finally broke. Okay? I got the whole story from my friend the next day. Turns out a fellow resident of the apartment complex had gotten drunk, lost his keys, and broken into his own apartment to go to bed. They thought it was mine and were confused by the lack of broken windows. I was terrified at the time, but it's a good story now. I was about 9 or 10. It was late at night and my bed was right under the window. I was just gazing out looking up at the sky when I saw what looked like a UFO. It was a white orb, rather large, shot straight into my line of vision, then moved in a few circles, then shot away. It came back and did the same thing, only it was closer and larger. It made no sound. I immediately got creeped out and walked from my room, around the corner, and was about to walk into my mom's room, but the door was locked. Her door was facing the stairs which went down to the living room/kitchen. Suddenly I heard someone coming up the stairs and a snorting sound. I looked down and saw this tall, slender figure walking up the stairs straight at me. I remember saying, "Dad?" but then saw that it was something inhuman. I immediately froze in fear. The creature, or whatever it was, tall, slender, 2 slits for a nose, large black eyes, got right up into my face, continuing to make that awful snorting sound. Kind of like the sound a pig makes. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, I just collapsed as it towered over me and bent down, pushing its face right into mine. Finally I blacked out. The next thing I know I was being awoken by my mom at the bottom of the stairs. She asked me how I got there, and said I must have slept-walked. I'll never forget that face and that snorting sound. And I think I'd die of a heart attack if I ever saw it again. I was 16, living with my dad. I was getting ready to go to sleep and suddenly it was like someone sat on the foot of my bed. I felt the weight settle down and the mattress/box spring creaked a little. I was laying on my side facing away at the time, so I sort of half sat up and half turned toward the foot of my bed. I could just barely make out the outline of a hunched over shadowy figure sitting there. The moonlight coming through the blinds gave it weird shimmery effect, almost like The Predator but with shadows, if that makes sense. I just kind of froze and all the hairs on my body stood on end. Not wanting to disturb whatever it was, I slowly laid back down while keeping my eyes on it. It was facing away from me and it didn't seem to be aware of me, or maybe it just didn't care. After a little while of staring at it, I slowly pulled my covers up over my face and started to silently cry a little bit because it was just too much. I was more terrified than I ever have been in my life and my adrenaline was racing. I don't know how long it was, but eventually I felt the weight ease off the bed. I sat there listening for any sign of what was happening, too afraid to peek out of the covers. I'd seen horror movies and that sounded like a really fucking bad idea at the time. A moment later a bunch of hangers in my closet jangled and I ripped the covers off to look, but whatever it was gone. In the floor of my closet were some clothes that had been hung up before. I have another story of living in that house if anyone's interested. It's not as good, but it was pretty much just as scary for me at the time. Years ago, I used to work at a church as the head sound engineer. The bulk of that job required me to be active during the day for Sunday services. Occasionally, there were tasks that could be done whenever I got the chance. One of these tasks was duplicating CDs of sermons for people who would like a copy to listen to at home, in the car, etc. I would get requests for various sermons, sometimes series spanning months, and have to make extra time to fulfill them since it usually took quite a while. Since I am a night owl, oftentimes I would head to the church and take care of these duplication requests in the middle of the night. Never bothered me and I had a key to get into the church whenever I needed to. One particular night, I headed into the church sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. Since I knew the building like the back of my hand, I rarely turned the lights on inside the building. The ambient light from street lights would illuminate through the windows just enough so that I could see where I was going, but beyond that the building was pitch dark. Now, the way this church was laid out was that there was a foyer, which then had doors into the church sanctuary, where the services were held. The sanctuary had a balcony. On this balcony was the sound booth, where the CD duplicator was located. There is only one door to the balcony, which could be locked from the inside, which was also located in the foyer, with a staircase leading up to it. The balcony is completely open, not separated by glass or anything, and provides a completely unobstructed view of the sanctuary below, the pews, stage, all of it. Acoustically the room is very good. If someone was on the stage talking, you could easily hear it from the back of the church and balcony. If for some reason you couldn't see what you were listening to, you could easily make out what part of the room the sound was coming from. This comes into play later. When I reached the top of the stairs to the balcony and the sound booth, I turned on a light so I could begin working. Just a single bulb about 15 feet above my head, I had no need to turn on anything more than that. This was the only light in the entire sanctuary. I know that might seem crazy to some, but this was a building I had spent hundreds of hours in by myself at night. I felt completely comfortable at the time. I began duplicating CDs, lost in my thoughts in the peaceful silence of the enormous room. After about an hour or so of silence, a sound abruptly rang out that startled me. About 20 to 30 feet ahead and below of me, in the middle of the pews on the left-hand side, I heard a distinctive clink clink sound. It was subtle but clear, and unmistakable to me. Over and over. I knew exactly what the sound was. Let me explain. In another part of the church, we had a coffee house of sorts, where people would load up on coffee and donuts every Sunday morning. The coffee was always dispensed into ceramic coffee mugs. Literally the most basic, commonly used mug you can imagine. Your kitchen cupboards are likely full of them. Anyway, due to the high volume of these mugs that circulated through the church, there were always baristas from the coffee house picking them up from around the church to be washed. Oftentimes they would miss mugs, however, and they would lay hidden around the church. As multiple mugs were usually collected in one hand, by the handle, mugs themselves would hit and make that distinctive ceramic clink sound. It became regular background noise before/during/after services. After about 10 years of working at this church, it's a sound I knew and recognized very well. But I would be lying if I said I ever consciously thought about that particular sound. So, I find myself trying to process why I'm hearing coffee mugs clinking together in the middle of the night, in the middle of our church sanctuary, in the pitch dark. I stood there peering from the balcony into the darkness below, trying to make sense of it for several minutes before curiosity got the best of me. I had to figure out what was making that sound. I descended the stairs and into the foyer, where the light switches were, and flipped them all into the on position. I immediately felt a little better and entered the sanctuary on the ground level. I had pinpointed where the ceramic sound was coming from when I was on the balcony, but unfortunately now that I was at the source, with the lights on, there was nothing to be heard. It was midweek, but the sanctuary had not yet been cleaned from the previous Sunday, so I knew that there were probably a few coffee mugs still inside. People frequently left them on top of pews, underneath them, and everywhere in between. I walked down each row of pews, carefully scanning for mugs. Nothing. Knowing there would likely be some on the floor, I got down on my hands and knees in the very front of the sanctuary so I could take a peek. From this perspective I could see underneath every pew on each respective side at once. Sure enough, there were a few mugs scattered throughout the floor, underneath certain pews. I got up and moved to those specific pews and examined where each mug was. In hindsight, I probably should have picked them up. I didn't, because technically it wasn't my job. But I did take note of the most important fact at the time: there were no coffee mugs in close proximity of each other. The closest was 3 or 4 feet from another mug. Not even remotely close enough clinked together. While I couldn't explain the sounds I heard, there was no logical way those mugs could have made those sounds. I had no answers, but I was satisfied enough to just brush it off. I left the sanctuary, turned off the lights at the light switch in the foyer, and returned back up the stairs to the balcony. Illuminated by just a single light bulb above me and consoled by the silence I found myself in once again, I resumed my tasks. About 15 minutes passed. Then it happened again. Clink clank, in the same place as before. Clink. My heart stopped and the hairs on my neck stood up again. Clink. Clink clank. Okay. I had verified this myself. There were no mugs in enough proximity that they could, somehow, for the sake of argument, be clinking on their own. They were not clinking on their own. I rushed down the stairs into the foyer and flipped on all the lights again. Entering the sanctuary, I dropped to my knees once more and peered under the pews. Nothing. I knew this sound. It was unmistakable. I pinpointed where it was coming from. But there was nothing. No sound. Nothing in disarray. No mugs that could be in any contact with each other. Spooked, but frustrated at the same time, I returned to the foyer. Instead of turning off all the lights, I left one on in the sanctuary. This made for 2 lights now, one in the balcony, and one in the sanctuary. The addition of this light helped set me a little more at ease as I walked through the balcony door at the bottom of the stairs. I locked it from the inside. I don't know what was going on, and maybe I was being a little paranoid at this point, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I went up the stairs, once again, to attempt to finish my tasks on the balcony. About half an hour of silence had elapsed. Just enough for me to settle into the idea of nothing weird happening for the rest of the night. Then it happened again. Clink clank. Might as well have been a gunshot. I stood up and scanned from atop my balcony. There was twice as much light in there now, and enough to illuminate the room even if it was still dim. But there was nothing. Nobody was playing a prank. There were no ghouls, specters, or shadow people dancing around. No big aha revelation. Clink. It continued. And so did I wanted to go home. So I ignored it. The sooner I finished duplicating these stupid CDs, the sooner I could get out of this damn church and get some sleep. Clink clink clank. Again and again. Maybe another 15 minutes, maybe another half an hour or so. I lost track of time. All I know is that eventually, it stopped. The silence returned. At one point, I resolved that all this was ridiculous. There had to be a rational explanation, and as such, it was stupid to hold up on my locked balcony. I went downstairs to get something to drink. On my way back, I flipped off that remaining light in the sanctuary. No need to waste electricity, I reasoned. I am not going to let some stupid sound dictate fear all night. I returned to the balcony and left the door unlocked. Illuminated once more by my single light bulb, I popped in a few more CDs. Then it happened. I don't even know how to effectively describe it, at least in a way that captures the immediacy and sheer terror of it. All at once, the entire room began to shake violently, with a deep, bass rumble. There are no earthquakes in this part of the country, so that was immediately ruled out. Time seemed to stop as I scanned around trying to figure out what was going on. I looked at the soundboard. You know those LEDs they have going from green to yellow to red? The thing was maxed out in the red, indicating it was overloaded by some sort of input. But there were no mics plugged in, no amps turned on, and no sound coming out of the speakers. I don't even think the speakers were plugged in, and if they were muted. At the time I had done professional audio for over 5 years, and this wasn't something technical. The entire sanctuary rumbled and shook, and in about 30 seconds it stopped. Complete silence. I was completely shaken, and I bolted out of the church and went home. I don't have any explanation for what happened. Since there were no ghostly things to show themselves or anything super paranormal, I have tried to explain it with logic. But alas. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more daily videos, and join the Spooky Squad.